residing there right there for the kind invitation to come here. I'm ashamed to say I came late the day before yesterday, so I've not had any time to see the city at all, but some future occasion, hopefully, since we had a full day of lectures yesterday. I would also like to mention that the work that I will present to you now is the fruits of a joint effort, a joint collaboration with my colleague Frederick Hagen, as was just mentioned, who's also a full professor in Copenhagen. So we have 50-50 credit for this work. I'd like to emphasize that also. So the subject is the Antiquities Trade in Egypt. And I would like to start sort of in medias res, so don't be surprised about that. And then I will backtrack a little bit and provide a context for what I'm doing. Okay, there we go. So you probably all know of this important discovery in 1922, and I will not be talking about Tutankhamun at all. And you also know the gentleman who found the tomb of Tutankhamun. And this was, of course, a discovery that received worldwide attention, the most publicized discovery in Egypt ever. What you may not know, and what will probably surprise you, is that after packing up in 1922, having found this enormous treasure, upon going back to Egypt, Carter did not go straight to the tomb of Tutankhamun. He went for a tour in Cairo, where he visited the antiquities dealer Maurice Nachman, who lived in this almost a palace, certainly a mansion, in the middle of Cairo. It was the former Italian club for the Italians living in Cairo, and he had purchased this mansion from that club. This is the main hall of his antiquities business. He was the main antiquities dealer in Egypt ever. More objects passed through him than any other dealer at any point in time. And what was Howard Carter looking at before going to the tomb of Tutankhamun? This, the Book of the Dead. This is not really what someone would imagine. And it's a very long Book of the Dead. It's a beautifully preserved one, but it's a Book of the Dead. And of course, Howard Carter couldn't even read it. He was not an Egyptologist. He could read no hieroglyphs. Of course, he learned a few hieroglyphs in his life, but he could never read a full inscription, and he certainly could not read hieratic. So why would he be spending weeks in Cairo before returning down south in Thebes to his golden treasure? Well, the papyrus had been put up for sale by Maurice Nachman. Here, both of them are together. And rolls of papyri were always valuable in Egypt. Ever since Egypt opened up to tourists, rolls could generate a lot of money. And Carter knew that there was a lot of money in this. And a lot of archaeologists didn't make a lot of money excavating, especially people like Carter. He made a fair salary for the time, I guess, but there was no retirement fund. So many of them sold antiquities on the side and tried to generate profit. And those profits could be quite considerable. So Carter, having found this papyrus and another papyrus with Nachman, contacted the Americans because they always had lots of money. And he asked the Metropolitan, the chief of the Metropolitan Museum, Lithgow, if they might be interested in such a papyrus. And they were, but they didn't have the funding. It was expensive. So they contacted Edward Harkness, one of the wealthiest Americans and a great patron, and asked him if he wanted to donate the money. And he just gave the money. It's a lot of money, but the guy was a multi-billionaire. And the papyrus was shipped off to the States all within the matter of 1 or 2 weeks. These are the accounts. The papyrus was acquired for just short 800 pounds, and it was sold on with a 200-pound profit. So from this one affair, which is just one acquisition by Gardner, he made, Carter. This is just one acquisition by Carter before going to the tomb of Tutankhamun. He made other acquisitions, but on this one sale, he netted a profit of 200 pounds. That was 1 year's salary for an Egyptian inspector at the time. So there was enormous money to be made. And this is why the tomb of Tutankhamun could wait a few weeks before he resumed the excavations. And this was true for many colleagues at the time. This is how they planned their retirements. And Gardner became extremely wealthy from this. Of course, discovering the tomb of Tutankhamun also helped, and all the money he got in from giving interviews and writing his book and so on and so forth. And with that, I would like to backtrack and then provide a context for the project. That was just an appetizer. The founder of the Egyptological department in Copenhagen is this gentleman you see on the left, Ho Lange, whom you may or may not have heard about. He had two careers in his life. He was the director of the Royal Library in Copenhagen for many years, but he was also a trained Egyptologist, and he was a specialist for hieratic, and he worked with Griffith and Gardiner and others, but he was very humble, and sometimes he asked not even to be included in books that he co-authored. So when Gardner published the edition of Hippoera, Ho Lange had done most of the work, but he thought that Gardner should have the credit for it for some obscure reasons. And Gardner tried to persuade him, we have the correspondence, that he should be the co-author. He had started the project, he had done most of the work, but not necessary for him. And so an interesting man in many ways. He was also the man who had the idea for the Bibliotheca Egyptiaca series that was funded by the Belgians and many other projects like that at the time. Now, he visited Egypt twice, first in 1899 for 10 months, and again exactly 30 years later in 1929. And Egypt had changed a lot in those 30 years. And what is remarkable about these visits is not so much the visits themselves, because many colleagues, of course, went to Egypt and worked there, and many went every year. But he left us extremely detailed diaries of his activities in Egypt, and they provide a wealth of information that is rarely accessible to us. And these are examples from his two diaries. The first visit is recorded in 800 pages, everything, weather, prices of certain things, events, people he met, good and bad hotels, and so on and so forth. And he also records visits to excavations and visits to antiquities dealers, and he describes their personalities, their networks, where they were located, and so forth. And we rarely have that kind of information. And having worked myself with papyri and many other objects from Egypt, I often have the frustration that many of these objects lack any archaeological context. Often they're simply said to be acquired at a certain year, I don't know, 1922, anything. And when you look up the museum records, usually there's a name of a dealer, not always, but there were no reference to the majority of the dealers. Who's who in Egypt doesn't really like Egyptians. They include a few inspectors, and there's a few dealers mentioned, but the dealers they mention are only the non-Egyptian dealers for some reason. I don't know if it's an explicit bias, but it's a little bit bizarre. If you're Egyptian and a dealer, you don't merit inclusion for some reason. It's probably just a coincidence. But Frederick and I, in the course of our work on the Antiquities Trade, managed to find over 200 dealers, often finding the addresses and other information about them. So we thought it might be useful to contextualize this and put it into a book and analyze it. So what I would like to talk about now is partly the demography, what kind of people were involved in the Antiquities Trade, and then the geography, where are objects acquired. They can be acquired anywhere, of course. But there are certain venues where the bulk of the material went through. As you will see, Cairo was the main hub ever. Probably 90% of everything went through Cairo. So of course you could buy objects at any archaeological site, but those were really small sales compared to the bigger ones. And then also I want to talk a bit about the mechanics, how the trade was actually conducted. So one of the challenges in writing the book was to create a terminology of the kind of people involved in the trade, especially because many individuals don't fit neatly into any single category. But these are sort of the rough categories that we came up with. We have what we call petty dealers, and then various professionals, mostly Egyptologists, but also other trade people working in Egypt. There's a lot of businessmen involved, consuls and consultants. The Bedouins at Kaf al-Haram are a special category, a very important category. And then there are professional dealers, shops at various places. And then not least the Egyptian Antiquities Service itself, which became a major dealer also. Petty dealers, of course, are everywhere. Petty dealers are sort of ad hoc dealers. Farmers who are out tilling the fields or whatever they're doing, or people renovating a building and they find something and they sell it. So this is just ad hoc sales of antiquities. It's not an organized trade. Hi, Julia. and here's some pictures of Lange. with petty dealers, and you get them everywhere. If you go to a ruin and you look like you have money, people would approach you and sell you genuine or fake objects, whatever they had available. The Egyptologists are a much larger category, and as I mentioned, many Egyptologists were involved in this trade, but usually we don't have much documentation about it. I mentioned the example of Carter, who became one of the main suppliers of antiquities. This is a role that's not particularly well known, but he was a major supplier. Another very important player among the Egyptologists is Ludwig Borchardt, whom you probably know from his excavations in Abu Sir and much other work. He was really a splendid scholar for his time in many respects. And I would like to talk a little bit about Borchardt, because he's one of the better documented ones, because he had a close friendship with Lange, with Borchardt, his wife, and Lange and his wife visiting, and they had a lifelong friendship. But Borchardt, you know, of course, also from Nefertiti and many other objects. Here, the Spezier Garden in Berlin, the famous one. This one, we actually managed to find out whom it was acquired from and exactly when it was acquired. Now, Borchardt, on the side of his academic activities, became the leading supplier of German museums, and sometimes even institutions outside of Germany. And we're talking about museums all over Germany, mainly the museum in Berlin, but also other museums. And tons of objects passed through, and he would acquire en masse, and it was shipped off in enormous crates, just like people like Budge would do for the British Museum and so forth. And sometimes we'll talk about shipments where they ship off 5-10 tons of antiquities. I mean, it's a scale you can hardly imagine. Of course, if you put one big stone coffin in there, that itself might be a few tons. So measures arbitrary. Then there are businessmen. And, what happened here? The slide seems to change a bit. A lot of businessmen in Egypt wanted to use the money they generated for some purpose. When they earned enough money, you don't just want to put it in the bank where you would get hardly any interest or very low interest. So often they were also money lenders on the side. And as money lenders, they would ask for some kind of security. And for many people, that security consisted of antiquities. So a lot of the businessmen in Egypt, Cairo, Alexandria, elsewhere, lent money against antiquities. So people would bring them antiquities, and they would then get some money. It's a little bit like going to a pawn shop. They would get a lot less than the actual objects were worth, and then the objects were kept at their residence. And if the men never returned to repay the debt, or they didn't return on time, well, then the antiquities were forfeited. They were basically confiscated, and they would then be sold on. So the geography of the trade, Cairo was always the main hub of the antiquities trade in Egypt, unsurpassed. And Cairo was really divided into two parts. One part was located around Esbekiya, the beautiful botanical gardens that don't exist anymore. There's a few trees left, but it's almost completely demolished now, but they were world famous. Esbekiya separated the European part, which you can see here. This is the European sector, from the Arabic part of the Cairo over here, made in the Mushki area. So this again is Esbekiya Garden as it looked about 100 years ago. Here you have Shepherd's Hotel. Shepherd's Hotel was the world's most famous hotel in its time. It's difficult to imagine now, but it was #1 in the world for many years, and a venue for millionaires. And when you have such a venue, obviously you have antiquities shops all the way around it. These people were filthily rich. Then there's the Continental Hotel and lots of other hotels. In the Esbekiya Gardens, there's the officers' clubs and many other clubs. You have the opera. So this was really the Manhattan of Cairo in its time. This is Shepherd's Hotel. And many individuals had ideas of selling objects to the extremely rich people that went there. The first one was an American called Blanchard, who was originally employed in the diplomatic service. And he also made money off that. He was single, and he invested that money in antiquities. And there was this building in the garden. This is the outer garden of the Shepherd's Hotel. And he asked if he could buy this little pavilion here, or not buy it, rent it. And the hotel said, sure. And he made a shop here. You can see the Antiquities sign here. It's in French. It had passed ownership at that point in time. And this was an Antiquities shop. And he made a fortune selling Antiquities there. And he mainly sold smaller objects. He didn't have big objects like sarcophagi and big sculpture and such, but small objects that the tourists could easily carry with them. So the millionaires there, when they were bored and went for a walk, they would go there, and the husband or the wife would find a few scarabs and pay some crazy amount of money for them. You would not like that, Marilina. I know that you're a scaraphobe. Another man who had the same idea later is Mansour. The family now is mainly famous for the Amana portraits, the so-called Amana portraits. There's been a lot of controversy about that. I will not go into that detail. But he was employed with the railways, and also started dealing antiquities. And he asked if he could put up a showcase, just a showcase, not an actual shop inside the hotel in the lobby. And they said, sure, and he would pay a fee, and he had that showcase. And he made so much money that he could buy one of the stalls. It's this stall over here, and this is the facade of it. And again, the family became millionaires from this trade. And there were other shops just across the street. This building is still standing. All the other buildings are gone now, but this building is still there. And over here, Jean Telot, again, one of the most prominent dealers ever in Egypt, had his shops. And there were many, many, many other Antiquities shops here. Almost all of this was filled with Antiquities shops down there. And it's right across the entrance. So you exit the hotel here, and just across the street, more Antiquities. And then there's Maurice Nachman. He was the guy that I mentioned earlier that Howard Carter was dealing with in the former Italian club there. As I mentioned, he was the biggest dealer ever. He worked at the bank, one of the major banks in Cairo, and had a good salary. He was a chief cashier, and he invested all his money in antiquities, which he dealt from an apartment originally, but soon became immensely rich. And so rich that he could buy the Italian club, and I don't know where the Italians went after that for their espresso in the morning. They probably found another venue. And it was converted, and this is what it looked like. He didn't just sell ancient objects. Also, when wealthy families needed money, he would buy big paintings from them and other things. So anything that was sold could be sold. This is the main hall. Sometimes it was more full, sometimes less full. But he also had other rooms in there, and there was a basement that was completely packed with antiquities. The other parts. This is a picture again from Lange's correspondence from the basement. He found a royal statue in the basement that he thought might be interesting. In the end, it was acquired by Philadelphia. Sometimes we could trace these objects. You can see the cupboards there. Even on some of the cupboards, it's just filled with stone jars and stuff. The house was completely packed. Certainly bigger than many small museums you see nowadays. But I think also notice the attendants in there. It's a shop for gentlemen, clearly, and ladies. And this is an example of the logistical abilities of some of these dealers. So Ho Lang founded our department. His professor, before the department was founded, Egyptology was already taught at the university. And his professor, Valdemar Schmidt, acquired on behalf of Carl Jacobson, a Danish businessman, 2 stone sarcophagi in 1909. But they were so big, they weighed 7 tons, that they couldn't load them on the ships because they didn't have trains that could lift those 7 tons. And then Maurice Nachman said, I will organize that. And he took care of the logistics. Even when the harbors couldn't do it, he made sure that they would be sent. And a couple of months later, they were in Copenhagen and in pristine condition. And this is something they also did, these professional dealers. They made sure that the objects were insured and well packed and shipped off, just like we do nowadays when we lend objects between museums. And sometimes they also sent out objects if they thought a certain institution was interested. They would actually send the object to Europe, to America, to be examined. And then if they didn't like it, they would just return it. Just like nowadays, if you buy clothes on the internet and they don't fit you, you just send them back. And they actually provided that same service even for antiquities back then. And of course, it was a gentleman's agreement that it would be sent back. But of course, the British Museum would not steal a sculpture if they didn't want it. If they didn't want it, they sent it back. So that was on the European side, some example. On the Arabic side, the other side of Esbekir, you have the Mushroom down here, a major trading area. This is what it looks like. Very different. The European sector had very broad streets, avenues really, with paving and trees on the side providing shade when you walked. In the Musli, very narrow, extremely crowded. But not here, there's a lot of sun deliberately, so you can take the photograph. But it's usually shaded. That's why the streets are so narrow, so it doesn't get too warm in there. And often they put out awnings. And there in many of the small side streets, there were also antiquities dealers. Here, Robert Viola, he was actually the son of Maurice Nachman. Nachman married two sisters. And with both of the sisters, the oldest son was named Robert. So he had two wives that were sisters, and the two oldest sons had the same name even. But one of them got his mother's maiden name, and the other one got his own name. So there are two Robert Nachmans out there that are sometimes confused. And this is one of them. This is the antiquities shop of Albert Eid, a Belgian originally. That shop was nationalized, and it was then run by Robert Viola because he knew the ins and outs of the trade since his father was one of the biggest dealers. So the Antiquities Service hired him to deal with that. This piece here is now in the Cairo Museum. So again, sometimes we can trace objects, not the scarabs, of course. And we don't want to either, it's too small. There's another of these shops in the side streets. You can see they're extremely narrow, some of these streets. I mean, 1.5 meters at most. This is the shop of the Hawam family. This family is interesting. This business was founded in 1862, and it's still alive. It now has a shop in Paris. They moved to Paris after the Antiquities Trade was banned in Egypt. And they're still active now. They've been dealing continuously since 1862. And they sell nice objects. And the way we do it nowadays is that if you need something, I've personally dealt with them, what they do is they use the old registers of the old customers. So if you know that if Marilina really wants a scarab, they will look at who have we sold scarabs to. I'm just kidding. It's an internal joke. But if you want something, you tell them you would like this, and they look at the old registers, and then they look up these individuals. And of course, most of them, you cannot find the families, but sometimes they can find the families still, and they ask them if they would like to sell for a profit. And sometimes it works. And so they did that for us recently for some papyri. And of course, we cannot buy something that's not legal, but they find something, and if the papers are there. And so, for instance, for us, they found some papyri that had been exported legally in the 50s and then sold in the 60s, and the family still had those papyri. And they said, yeah, they would like to sell them. And those papyri, they paid they were sold for 10 Egyptian pounds originally, and then something else in Cairo, I can't remember. But of course, we paid 100 times as much for them. I mean, there's a lot of money in this still. But this is how they do their business now, because of course, they don't get any stock from Egypt. That's prohibited. And if they do that, they can't sell anymore. So there's no reason for them to do it. And with the kind of money they're making, they don't need to sell more than an object a month to make much more money than I do in a year. And they do sell more than one object a month. But this is their shop around 1930. And if we go inside, this is what I used for the cover photo. This is what it looks like. And again, these are not specialized shop for pharaonic antiquities, which is probably what you're interested in. They have everything from the pharaonic period to the Ottoman period and later even, whatever you can sell. And of course, inevitably, there will be some fake objects there. This is the family, the founder. It was founded in 1862, we know now. And then it was handed up to Joseph, his son, and Rocher, the grandson. He died a few years ago. And he also sold material to our papyrus collection many years ago. But all institutions have dealt with them. The British Museum, Louvre, everyone has dealt with them. And Bertrand is now leading the business. His brother Roland is also involved. This is one of the more famous pieces. This is Haremhab before he became a king, but he was already a deputy king at the time, which is a remarkable status. It's in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. These are some of this is Rocher, who died a few years ago, some of the papyri that were acquired by our institution in the 50s. Now, I mentioned businessmen who made money selling objects, lending money against objects. An example of that is Andre Bircher, a Swiss businessman. He made tiles and ceramics and such in Egypt and became exceedingly wealthy, and again invested a lot of money in antiquities. Well, lent a lot of money out against antiquities. And he purchased a whole palace in the Muscat area. This is the entrance to that. It's a fantastic building. And when he passed away, he had a collection of more than 17,000 antiquities that had not been sold on. But of course, he was a dealer. He lent money out, he got objects in, and then he sold them on. But there was still 17,000 pharaonic antiquities in his collection when he passed away. And you can't see it here, but this piece here, for instance, is an old kingdom relief. And although the photograph is this small, you can actually enlarge it and read the inscription on the relief with a good scanner. And then you're close to Cairo is Kaf El Haram, which is, Kaf El Haram means the pyramid village. And it is the village just in front of the pyramids that doesn't exist anymore. And at that time, the pyramids were outside of Cairo. Now Cairo has expanded, but it took an hour or two to get out there at that point in time.
I was to say, it takes 1 hour.
Oh, yeah, because of the traffic. Yes, that's true. Yes, yes. You go at 3 at night and it's easier. So here's the plateau with the 3 big pyramids that you all know. And this is Kaf El Haram down there. And this is a special village because the people who lived there were Bedouins. They did not identify as Egyptians per se. They were regarded as a distinct element, although they lived in Egypt. This is the road that led out there. Then people went out there by carriage. That was the only option. Later you could go there by car. And this is from a visit to that village by Lange. Now it's a Bedouin village, so you cannot just go there. You go there by invitation. And a lot of what they do was they engaged in a lot of criminal activities. So they had a sort of quasi-status, slightly comparable to the Romas in some society, to some extent, at least in relation to the authorities. So this is Schäfer, the Egyptologist, and Lange's wife, and then these are people from the village, some of the dealers that are meeting them. And this is, when you look at the village, it looks dark here, I think because of the light. And these are the outskirts of the village. What you see here are Old Kingdom tombs. This is the plateau and the pyramids. The first one is over here and then in the background over there. And of course, being situated right next to the ruins of Giza, they had access to a mass of antiquities. And they exploited that to the extent that they became one of the leading hubs of the antiquities trade. After downtown Cairo, this was the area through which most antiquities passed, but it was very different because you went there by invitation. But even the millionaires who collected antiquities, those that were passionate about it, they actually went to this humble place and visited it. An enormous contrast between these people who were very different. And I have a description of what the antiquities trade was like, because it was not legal for them to do it. And the British were extremely upset about this. But the British had more or less absolute jurisdiction in Egypt, except for the Bedouins that was under the French mandate. This was an agreement. And so the French provoked the British by letting the Bedouins do whatever they wanted, simply as a provocation. And so the French had good relations to the Bedouins, the British and the Americans hated the Bedouins there. And so because the trade was illegal, they did what they could to hide it, in contrast to what went on in Cairo. So this is a description of Lange of one of his visits. So he mentions that they arrived at Giza and they received a messenger from Muhammad Ali. He's one of the big dealers. His father was the biggest Bedouin dealer there. And so they lead through a difficult route. It's like a labyrinth out there. And they go through slopes and the sand. They get to Kaf El Haram, and then they meet Muhammad Ali himself. And then they go through a most remarkable route, so in and out through the city. And then they crawl up a hemcoot ladder like this. I don't know if you can see the ladder there. And they get to the top of the house. And then they have to walk on the edge of the walls, just like we do on the ruins now when we visit the sites sometimes, if the directors are not present and they don't see it. And then they go into a building. So what he has a room where there's no entrance to the room. So it's a hidden room, and that's where he keeps the antiquities. So you go up there by climbing up a ladder, walking along the edge to another part of the building, and then there's a room with no entrance. So when the village is raided, which it was from time to time, you don't see it because there's no entrance, so well hidden. And then another example here, Soliman, another big dealer, again a major dealer. He had a statue that he was selling, so he kept it locked up and it was hidden under the bed, again in a room that was not used, so a room that's in disrepair. If the village is raided, it looks like it's not roomed, used, but they kept antiquities in that room. And there's a lot of descriptions like that. Now, all of this trade was illicit, but the French had good connections to the Bedouins, and since the Egyptian Museum was directed by Frenchmen after Emile Brooch, the Cairo Museum actually acquired a lot of objects from these same dealers, some of the major thieves in that area. This is an example of Reisner, who worked at the pyramid site, as I think you all know, and he was furious about these Bedouins. He mentions here the natives at Kaf al-Aram were carrying on systematic excavations there. They actually had real excavations, or whatever you want to call it, and just constantly selling objects from the tombs that he and the Germans and others were working on. And so when he found here in 1912 an intact tomb, they need to put guards there, 20 guards, because if you just have a few guards and this whole village comes up, there's nothing you can do. So they have 20 guards there with unlimited cigarettes and coffee to guard the tomb at night, so that they can clear out the tomb, because if they leave it, when they return, there will be no reliefs, there will be nothing left inside of the tomb. So horrible condition. So he was very angry. And one of the main culprits was this guy, Ibrahim Faid, an interesting character because he was actually an inspector from the Antiquities Service. And he was organizing some of the worst illegal excavations there at the same time, and it was known. But he was a good friend of Masperos, so for a long time he was just left to do his thing. But finally in 1912, he was convicted because of Reisner and other people, and he was sentenced to 5 years hard labor. This is a severe punishment in Egypt. Hard labor is hard labor. You may not ever get over that afterwards. So Reisner was very happy about this. We have some of the letters, but I don't have that here. But Masperos was a friend of his, so Masperos launched an appeal on his behalf, and within 2 weeks he was released from prison thanks to Masperos, and he continued the illegal excavations, and he became the inspector assigned to the German mission at Giza, so they had to use him as an inspector while he was carrying on this illegal work. It's a crazy world, really. So the most important among the Bedouin dealers is this humble man. This is Muhammad Ali, the man that Lange mentioned before. This is his father, who goes by many names, which confused us in the literature. His name was Ali Abd al-Hajj al-Jabri, but he was often just called Ali al-Arabi. And when you're called Arabi at this point in time, it means that you're Bedouin, not that you're Arabic, but a Bedouin. So that's important to keep in mind. So Ali al-Arabi means Ali the Bedouin. He's also called Ali the Bedouin sometimes. But he's referred to by, I don't know, 5, 10 different names. And it took a while before we realized that all these important Alis was just one man. Another problem in dealing with the antiquities dealers is that often the names are inverted. And of course, there are many people called Ali Muhammad or Muhammad Ali. You have people of both names. But because we're used to using surnames, when the Egyptians heard that someone was called Muhammad Ali, in the letters they would often say, "Dear Mr. Ali." But that's not what the Egyptians do. They use the first name, we use the second name. So in some cases, when we have an Ali Muhammad in the records, it's actually Muhammad Ali. And we found many examples of that. And sometimes it's impossible to know who it is, because you have two individuals with the same, similar names at the same place. Now, it's in dealing with the descriptions of these dealers, of course we know as scholars that you always have to be careful, because one person's understanding of a given situation might differ from someone else. I sometimes meet a colleague where I know that one of my other colleagues is less appreciative of that colleague, and I find that colleague nice, or vice versa, and it will probably happen to you too. And of course, everyone should form their own opinions. And a good example of that concerns Muhammad Ali. Now, Lange did not like him at all. His wife refers to him as a real tree, and one of the most repulsive individuals on earth. This is a horrible description. The thing is, he drinks, and they were teetotalers. They did not drink at all, and they ran campaigns against the consumption of alcohol. And because he was a Muslim who drank, they had no respect for him. They were also very religious, so even if they weren't Muslims, they didn't like the idea of a religious person drinking. But Valdemar Smith, who was the former professor of Lange, he visited him just a few years later, and he refers to him as one of the nicest and most reasonable of the Bedouins. And so this is the professor and his student with two very different assessments. And this is important to keep in mind, that when we have these descriptions, in the book, we write what they say, but of course we don't have any value or moral judgment of these characters. We will never meet them, and so we cannot really do that. Another person, interesting person from Kaf el-Aram is Saki Mahmoud Abdesamad. He came from a very prominent family. They're almost all related somehow, by the way. It's one big network. And most of them have the same descendant who came from, I think, Tunisia or somewhere 100 years earlier. He's interesting for several reasons. One of the reasons is that he opened an antiquities shop in Cairo, and the Bedouins were normally forbidden to do that. So we don't really know how that happened. He's also interesting because he's one of the originally low-level dealers, not a petty dealer. He wasn't an ad hoc dealer. He did deal, but just on a low level. But he and some of the others offered their services to wealthy people who visited, and semi-wealthy people. Lange was not wealthy, but he represented a Danish businessman who had a lot of money, and he met Lange by coincidence, and he said, I can introduce you to other people. In the beginning, Lange was skeptic, but they developed a friendship, and he realized, going with this man who knew everyone, he visited a lot of people to whom he would never have access, and sometimes this man negotiated down the price. Of course, he got a commission for that, but it meant that Lange could use the funding he had for more than he would have been able to under normal circumstances. And we have other examples of people doing that, many other examples. And sometimes they would even travel with them. So you can't read this because the resolution is not high enough on the projector. But this is a forefather of most of the Bedouins living in Kaf el-Haram. And all the ones where there are dates in red, which will be illegible to you, those are people that are dealers, and two branches of the family. But what we discovered is that almost all of them are related to one another whenever we have information about their background. Of course, there's a lot of them where we just don't know their families, but whenever we do know them, they're all related. And this also explains sometimes why objects from the same discovery are sold by different individuals. And this is important because this has not been known before. So for instance, the Amarna tablets, a famous example of something that was discovered and sensational. At least 3 of these individuals sold Amarna tablets. And now we know that they're just part of the same family. So they were stored there, and whatever family member met someone would then offer these tablets. And if the price was good enough, they would sell them. So they're simply keeping a lot of these antiquities within the family, and it doesn't really matter who sells them. After Cairo and Kaf el-Haram, Luxor, of course, was the main venue, and it was the main venue for the trade in the south. It is both surprising and not surprising. It's surprising in the sense that Kena up here was a much larger Sydney, and it was a business district, Kena, but no tourists went to Kena. Luxor was a little village. When Lange visited Luxor in 1899, there was no electricity, no sewers, nothing there, not very many people there. But Cook and Sons had already begun organizing tourist travel. As you know, Egypt was the first major charter destination anywhere in the world, and they were organizing visits to Luxor. So certainly a lot of tourists were visiting Luxor, and because of that, a lot of antiquities trade developed at Luxor. There were antiquities trade before, but it became much more systematic. And most of it took place around the Luxor temple, because the Karnak ruins, they were accessible, of course, but a lot of the Karnak ruins were at that point still covered, and the Luxor temple simply had more to display at that point in time. So many of the dealers were located even within the Luxor temple, and in the surrounding area, especially this street up here, the Kanda. So when you visited, when you came with the boat here, this is the pier. It's a little bit too dark. I don't know, perhaps it's the computer, the projector. But this is the scene. You see, this is one of the policemen there controlling and people peddling objects, you know, selling water and oranges and cigarettes and whatnot. From the other side, this is where you would land. From the other side, this is the side of the ruins. This building here belonged to Boulos Tudros, who was the main dealer in the south. So he was like Nachman and Ali al-Arabi in the north. And this whole building was filled with antiquities, and visitors described it as a veritable museum because it was that large. This is Mustafa Akka's house in the background, the guy involved with the discovery of the royal mummies at Diyarbakir. And the French were located down here. Arthur, the famous photographer, had a studio here. Next to it, Cook and Sons had their office. So there was a lot going on right here. Here's a map of the main dealers. So Tudor's Bulos out here, this is the house I showed you before. This is a map of the ruins. That's why the house is not drawn in. It's a brand new map that will be published by the Americans. I don't think it's published yet. Tudor's Bulos here, and later his son Robert Tudor's. Ali Ledit was also a big dealer. We don't know so much about him, but he had shops in different parts of Egypt. He had the corner up here where he had his wife. You know him from the papyrus, and very eccentric American. Lived here in a house belonging to Mustafa Akka over here, and on the force down here, where the French consular agent conducted Antiquities Trade in the southern part. So here Mustafa Akka's house and Eklund Smith's house. Mustafa Akka is an interesting character. He was originally a consular agent for the Americans, and a lot of visitors to Egypt in their diaries don't understand why anyone wanted to be a consular agent. When you're a consular agent, it means that if someone visits, if an American tourist comes and falls ill, you have to find a hospital, you have to correspond with the American authorities, and you get a very symbolic salary. It's a very low salary, not something you can live from. And so many tourists wonder, why do people want this job? But the thing is, once you become a consul or a consular agent, you get diplomatic immunity. And this rumored very quickly, and so a lot of Egyptian people who had estate holders mainly, and people who had money otherwise, but a lot of them were just estate holders, they signed up to become consul agents. And they were very efficient in doing it, to be fair. But sometimes they didn't even speak the language of the country they represented. Some of them did. Mustafa Akka is said to have spoken 14 or 15 languages. I mean, clearly he was gifted to that respect, but a horrible person. But he was first a consul agent for the Americans, then he became a consul agent for the British, and I think it was the Dutch, and I think the third country, I think Russia, something like that, I can't remember. And after the big scandal, when he was involved in the plundering of the Diyarbakir cache with the royal mummies, he was afraid that he would lose all these consulships that he had, but he only lost the Dutch one, but not the British one, because the Brits received so many antiquities from him. So although he was a crook, they didn't want to throw him out, because then someone else might get the antiquities. So there's some real-life politics there. He's an elusive character. This is the only photograph we have been able to find when he was young and already surrounded by a lot of kids. So this is some of the stuff that he was involved in. But he was a shady character. He was a gentleman to millionaires, but we have accounts of him, and he was a slave trader before he became an antiquities dealer. After he became an antiquities dealer, he also became an estate holder, and he still used forced labor. So he had what amounted to real slaves on his estates. When Maspero decided to clear the Luxor temple and make it available for tourists, he had a problem with all these dealers living there, because they had earned the right, the sort of squatters' right to the area where they lived on. So he could expropriate it, but he had to pay them. And of course they have to negotiate a compensation. And what Mustafa Akka did when this happened was he immediately expanded his house and started building a lot of structures around it that weren't used, so he could demand more money. And he wanted something crazy. He wanted far more money than all the other people living there combined. And a horrible person, really. And in the end, they didn't give him that. And because he had never paid his taxes, he had diplomatic immunity. So the moment he became, all of them did that. They stopped paying taxes the moment they got it. And because he owed so many years of taxes, he wouldn't get anything at all when it was expropriated. So whatever they gave him, you would never see a penny. And everyone was very happy about that, because no one really liked him. But the tourists who visited him were very impressed. And one of the things he did, let's see if I have a picture of that now. I don't. One of the ways he sold antiquities was, because he was so wealthy, he had spies and people looking out at the quay, the harbor, also people in Cairo. And when millionaires arrived in Egypt, it was always rumored, and he would be telegraphed, or people would sail down and tell him, and he would send out people. And when it was seen that they were arriving, of course, everyone arrived by boat. And when the millionaires arrived, they were not passengers on a passenger ship. They rented their own boats, and you put up the flag. So if it's an American, there's an American flag to show that there's an American. So he would know when they arrived before they were there, and he would then organize a big celebration for them and send out people to invite them, nice suits and so forth. And then you would have the fantasia. Those of you who have worked with it know what a fantasia is. Sort of a lavish, dinner party, I guess. And so they would go there and they would have an enormous meal, many courses and so forth. And of course, you put the guest in debt by doing that. And in the middle of the meals, and this was systematic, we found out, in the middle, someone knocks on the door and they come in, lots of talk, lots of excitement, and they would claim that they had just found an intact tomb, completely unique, and they would bring in stuff, fantastic, and the visitors, of course, would be aroused, interesting. They get to see different objects they have never seen before and touch them and so forth. And he would then say, because they're his friends, if they're interested, they could buy them. And of course, all these objects were already stored and ready outside, and they did not come from one tomb, and it had not been recently found. And some of them were fake, of course. But many people bought objects, partly because they were excited in the moment. It generated that drama, but also because they felt obliged. When you've enjoyed 7 courses, you need to do something, if nothing else, just to escape from the phase. And the other ones start doing it too. So Bulos Tutros did the same thing, and they all start doing that. They are wealthy people, so they can entertain the guests. And they would put up a pavilion and make a little procession, like rolling out the red carpet, not a red carpet, but the same sort of idea. Bulos Tutros is also one of the early dealers. This is him as a young man in 1868. And his business also continued for 100 years. It continued to his son and his grandson, but not his great-grandson. He was the one who operated the business over here. That business was eventually expropriated when he died in the 70s. The Antiquities Service expropriated everything that was there because he was engaged in so much illegal trade. And they had lost the consulship. He was also a consul agent, and him too for many years, representing first Prussia, and then after the unification of Germany, they represented Germany. But when the First World War broke out, all the Germans in Egypt were incarcerated, and as a consul agent for Germany, he would also be incarcerated. So he had to give up his consulship, and the second he did that, the authorities moved in to confiscate some of his lands and his house at Luxor. So that made life more difficult for them. Now, as with Cairo, there's also a little satellite hub for Antiquities Trade in the south, Sheikh Abdul Ghana, but it was never a major place like Kafar Haram. There wasn't actually any real organized trade. There's a lot of dealers there, but minor objects generally. Most of what they sold in this area were actually people working on the European and American excavations who would steal objects from the excavations and then sell them. Of course, they also found objects during illegal excavations, but it was estimated at the time among the people excavating there. There was a lot of excavation there then as now, not as much as now, but a lot. But the general estimate was when you excavated at Thebes, you would lose perhaps 20% of the objects. That's a lot. And so we know some of the people who excavated there, like Bruyère, for instance, who excavated at Del Medina. When he came back to Del Medina, that was in the 30s, he would visit all these little dealers and buy objects back that had been stolen from his own excavations. And that is how it worked, and there was no way around it. A place that is more surprising is Alexandria. There was trade in Alexandria, but it was very, very limited, which was a little bit surprising to us because Alexandria was a major business area because of the sea lines and the connections with Europe. But it was simply too far removed. And many visitors didn't really spend much time in Egypt. They came there and then they went straight to Cairo afterwards. So there was simply not a big enough market in Alexandria, but it was really a thriving area, a very, very beautiful area back then. And it was so difficult that even purchased loads of antiquities in Egypt. When he went there, he had to inquire with a lot of people to try to actually find dealers. He couldn't find any by himself up there. One of the more important people up there, but he mainly dealt in Cairo, is Theodor Graf, an Austrian businessman who went to Egypt and started dealing carpets. And like Andre Birsch and many other businessmen, he lent out money against antiquities. And he was extremely fortunate. He didn't deal antiquities for many years, really, but he got some of the best finds that were available at the time. So he laid his hands on almost all the famous mummy portraits. He laid his hands on almost all of the Amarna tablets, or at least the largest part of them, and also the famous Coptic taste tiles in certain other groups. But he just had a very good network. He sent people out to all sorts of sites, and they reported back, and he went out there, he paid good money, and he generated enormous profits from this. Medina del Fayum also had trade, but again, a much smaller trade than one might imagine, considering how many sites exist in the Fayum area, mainly Greco-Roman, but also earlier sites. This is what it looked like a little more than 100 years ago. More beautiful than now, I think. This is an important building because it sports a flag from some institution, and we know that there were consulates also there, but the photograph is too blurred for us to make out the flag, but it might be the resident of some consular agent, but it's impossible for us to make it out. But when Valdemar Smith, the professor for Ulange, when he visited the site, I can't remember, around 1900, he could only find 3 places that sold antiquities, and they belonged to one man who had 3 wives, and he had put 1 wife in each of the shops, and they then took care of it. And then we don't know what the dash means. So it says that they belong to the same man, and each house had a shop and dash a wife. So whether it's for pause or an expletive or something, we don't know. And then there's Kena. As I mentioned, Kena was the main business district in the south of Egypt. So a lot of money there, but virtually no antiquities trade. It was the regional, what would you call it, the capital. And we know there were some families there that were involved in antiquities trade. And there's a lot of antiquities in the region. Abydos, Dentra, all of these places are relatively close to Kena. And some of these families established shops there, but they didn't sell enough. Some of the Egyptologists like Borchardt and Carter and Lange and so forth would go there, but there were no tourists. So the families that lived there, most of them opened shops in Luxor instead, or they sent their stock north to Cairo. It was not viable. So I talked about businessmen, consul agents, Bedouins, and professional dealers with shops. I did not talk about the antiquities trade. I need to check for the time. We began a little bit fast, so I can go on a little bit more. Is anyone exhausted? Let me know. Just close your eyes and start snoring, and I might get the message. Now, the Antiquities Service was heavily involved in the antiquities trade, both officially and unofficially, both legally and illegally. One of the most shady characters is Emil Brugsch, whom you see here. Emil Brugsch is a really interesting character. He was not liked by most professional Egyptologists. He was not an Egyptologist by training, and as a young man, he had had a dubious career. He had gone to America, and he had led so-called, I think he calls it a singing group of women around. There's some speculation about whether it was really prostitutes that he was working with, especially because while leading these young women, he developed his photographic skills. So there were a lot of rumors about him. And after failing to have the success he wanted in America, he went to Egypt, where his older brother Heinrich Brugsch was, and Heinrich was well connected, Heinrich Brugsch, and he was the director of the Giza Museum, the Bulak Museum, and later he became the director of the Giza Museum and then the Cairo Museum. So he's the only one who has been the director of all 3. But he didn't have an Egyptological background. His only skill was his ability to photograph not just young women, but also antiquities. And actually, to be fair, his photographs are amazing. A lot of them still exist. You will see them in Catalogue General in some of the volumes and elsewhere. And here's photographing the Dilbaki cache, some of the material from that. But he also wanted to have a nice retirement. And so he sold loads of antiquities. And much of that money seems to have gone straight into his private purse rather than into the Antiquities Service. And he too, like some of the dealers, when very wealthy people visited, he as the director of the museum would offer to take them around on tours and even travel with them in Egypt, acquire antiquities. And some of the dealers they visited were some of the most notorious dealers that were doing illegal excavations. And he knew it, and he was the director. And he still went there and he helped wealthy people, the Archduke of Austria, people like that, acquiring objects. So he was involved in a lot of trade and everywhere. Even in India, we found objects in India that was acquired through him, some dignitary visiting Egypt. In 1886, something important happened in the Antiquities trade. Lucien Crépeau was made director, and he had very strong feelings about the illegal antiquities trade, in contrast to Emile Bruch. Emile Bruch was still the director of the museum, but he was the director of the Antiquities Service. And at that point in time, the Amarna tablets were being sold. Many of them ended up in Germany within no time, and it was immediately realized they were extremely important, especially for the biblical dimension, all the Levantine states and so forth at that point in time. Now we use them for different reasons. And he wanted to stop this trade. And he decided to make a national raid on dealers. So in 1888, on New Year's Day, he made raids on dealers everywhere in Egypt on New Year's Day 1888. And he had managed to keep it secret, which is amazing at this point in time, especially in Egypt. So the policemen all over Egypt had been told, on this date you go out and raid, and they did that all over Egypt. And the dealers, of course, were furious about this. And people, a lot of the people involved in the trade, Egyptologists, were also furious because they wanted to buy many of these objects. So after the first round, people thought, okay, now it's over at least. But then April 1st, he made another round. And then half a year later, a third round. So in 1 year, he had 3 national rounds of ransacking these shops. And the museum ended up with such a massive amount of antiquities that they didn't know what to do with it. And then it was decided by the ministry that they had to set up salle de vente. They had to get rid of some of this. They had too much. And this is the year where the Antiquities Service officially started dealing antiquities, 1888, because of his raids all over Egypt. And from that point in time, there was a shop, first in the Giza Museum and later on in the Cairo Museum, where the museum sold surplus antiquities. And they sold enormous amount. This is the gardens of the Giza Museum. The shop was right over here. And in the museum, you all know this part here where the director now sits was the antiquities shop. So the library here, so for the scholars of the academic work, and here for the sale, this whole part here was just sale, just crammed with stuff that you could buy. Also monumental sculpture, anything you can imagine was available. I mean, you couldn't get something from the galleries, of course, but they were selling a lot of stuff. And they even got, they even got to the point where they started organizing big excavations carried out in a few weeks on important sites, only with the object of selling the antiquities. So exactly the same as what was done during the illicit excavations. No recording of context, no reports, nothing. Just going over through a large area in order to find bronzes, sculptures, sculpture, anything that might be sold. An example of the kind of stuff that you could buy is this. I use this because it's a master by our own collection. So Valdemar Smith, again, the professor of Lange, was sent to Egypt on behalf of this Danish businessman. He had a room in the Glyptotek, one of the art museums in Copenhagen. It's not this room, it was a different one. And he wanted a master chapel of a certain size because it had to fit within that room that was already there. And so they wrote to the Antiquities Service, and then James G. Bell, who was excavating at Saqqara, was told, we want to sell a tomb chapel of these dimensions. And then he went out and he cleared a lot of mastabas, and then he took Valdemar Smith for a walk, and for 3 days they just walk around and they look at different tomb chapels. And then he said, I'd like that one. And then they sent people in, they started cutting out the reliefs. And this was done for institutions all over Europe and the States. And that's how many of the tomb chapels arrived here. People were sent there, and they went in there, and they just picked out what they wanted. And sometimes we don't even know what mastabas they are. There are a lot of mastabas where the whole inner facade of the chapels is gone. Here the laws. The laws in Egypt were very ineffective until 1983, really. The first laws came from 1835 on the incentive of Champollion, in fact. He had seen that, I think, about 16 temples or so, something like that, had disappeared between the Napoleonic expedition and his visit to Egypt in the 20s, I think. And he thought it was urgent that something should be done to protect the monuments. And there was a high order by Muhammad Ali, not the Antiquities dealer, of course, by that name, but one of the 10,000 other Egyptians with that name. But it was completely ineffective. There were also plans for a museum that was never realized. The first real law came in 1912, and it was quasi-effective. And then the laws that are still used now were made in 1983 that completely banned any trade and private ownership of antiquities in Egypt. And that was quite effective. Of course, there's still illegal trade, but it's relatively small. Let's get this one in the interest of time. So the law in 1912 is important because they made for the first time authorized dealers. Before then, anyone could deal antiquities in principle. And so licensed dealers had to have real shops. They also have to be in a tourist area. You're not allowed to open a shop if there's not tourists. So you can open up shops in Cairo and Luxor and certain other places, but many places you could not. And it was explicitly noted in that law that the Bedouins at Kaf al-Aram were not allowed to deal in antiquities. But the French directors continued to deal with them after this, nonetheless. There were also what they called so people who just put up stalls and took them down, but they could only sell low-value objects. £5 was still money at the time, but it's relatively low level. Now, these licensed dealers had to have a register where they registered all the objects, and from time to time there would be an unannounced inspection of the shop, and all the objects in the shop had to be in the register. And they would then pay a tax on the sale to the Antiquities Service. First 1.5%, later 2%, and then it was raised to 2.5%. It's a small sum. But there were many ways around it. This, again, not the Book of the Dead, but it's one of the largest Book of the Deads that exist. This was showed by Jean Tadeau, whom I showed you earlier. He had the shop in front of the Shepherd's Hotel. And he knew that this shop would not be approved. Oh, something I didn't mention, the authorized dealers, when they sold something, it had to be in the logbook, but before it was exported, it still had to be shown to the Egyptian authorities, so to the Antiquities Service. And if the object was considered national treasure, they would keep it. And this was one of the longest books of the dead. It's late, it's Ptolemaic, but beautifully preserved. And he was very sure that it would not be allowed for export, and it probably wouldn't. So what he did was, there was a rock dealer across the street, just a man selling rocks and blankets. So he kept it with the man across the street, and when a wealthy American buyer came, they went across the street to this shop. So if his shop was raided, they wouldn't find the papyrus, and they wouldn't see that it wasn't in his logbook. So there was many ways of circumventing these laws. This is also Jean Tadeau, again. This is in his house at Mataria, up by Heliopolis. And this is the largest group of Old Kingdom tomb figures ever found in Egypt. And of course, it would never have been allowed, to export this. So he kept it at his private residence, hoping that it wouldn't be raided. And the American colleague of ours who acquired it, when we enhanced the contrast, we could even see his face. You don't see it when you just look at the image, but when you play with the contrast, you get this ghost image. And it's also now in America. Actually, the papyrus in this group went to the same institution even. I will not name it. We didn't write this book to shame anyone. And also, when we do mention examples of dubious sales, we decided we mention those examples that have been mentioned by those institutions already, because we have enjoyed the privilege of using records, and of course we don't want to abuse that. It's a sensitive kind of topic. Now, something that's important for the scale of the Antiquities trade is to look at how many dealers there were. And when they instituted the licenses in 1912, he only handed out about 100 licenses. So there was 100 authorized dealers, and before then there had been many hundreds. So it was a reduction. So these are the legal dealers, and the highest number ever is 127. So the licenses are numbered. You simply have a permit number, number 1, number 2, number 3. It doesn't mean that there were only 127 between 1912 and 83, of course, because once someone passed away, that permit with that number would then be used for someone else. It could be taken over by his son if he applied for it and it was approved, or another family could have the same number. So if someone has license number 99, it can be one family, 1 year and 40 years, it can be another family. But so on average, there would have been not more than 100 professional dealers in Egypt. Now, so we've talked about objects from, oh no, I didn't do this. It's how you obtain antiquities. So one way of obtaining antiquities is through official excavations where you get a permit. And antiquities dealers could also conduct official excavations. They could have a legal permit to excavate. So that is not illicit excavation. One of them is Farag Ismail, again, one of the Bedouins from Kaffa el-Aram, and he was very effective in securing permits. So he excavated at many sites, but he actually had permits. So technically it was not plundering. And when he excavated, like everyone else does, the partage, he would go to the Antiquities Service, and they would then divide the antiquities in two. He gets one half that he can sell, and they would keep the other half for the museum. But of course, inevitably, these dealers would take objects that were exciting from the excavation and just, not include them in the partage. But this is one way the museum got objects and the dealers got objects. And then there are people like Petrie. And if you look at this picture, it looks just like some of the antiquities shops. And Petrie, of course, is renowned for all the good things that he did. But he was also heavily involved with the trade. He needed to sell objects to finance his expeditions. At least they went to for a good purpose. The dealers just used it for personal enrichment. But after he completed the season, he developed a system where objects were displayed, and his sponsors could go and first pick out the objects they wanted. But then, of course, the objects left, and people could negotiate for those objects. And Petrie, for instance, was furious about Farag Ismail's excavation at Havara, because Farag Ismail found a lot of mummy portraits and other objects, and he refers to Farag as that brood of a plunderer. But when Petrie went there, he opened many hundreds of tombs in a few weeks. But of course, in his excavation reports, there are plans of a few of them. He destroyed hundreds of tombs in his search for antiquities that he could sell to sponsor the excavations. And especially in those early years, Petrie also did a lot of destruction, a lot of excavation that was not documented. So the line between a dealer and someone like Petrie, it's relatively thin. And then, of course, there are legal excavations. I mentioned the Al-Bahri Royal Cache. Now, an interesting thing is, when you get objects from illicit excavations, if those objects were sold through authorized dealers after 1912, if that object is listed in the logbook and you pay your tax to the Antiquities Service and they approve the sale, that object becomes kosher, then it's a legal object. So most of what was sold by the antiquities dealers, not all of it, some of it is from excavations for which they had permits, but most of what they had were found by private people or during illegal excavations. But once those objects have been authorized for export, they were legal. So a lot of what is in the museums nowadays might have been illegally excavated, but it wasn't illegally sold. So it seems almost paradoxical. And then, of course, there's dealers excavating. I already named another example, so I will skip over that in the interest of time. I'm running a little bit late. Then there are also acquisition of objects from abroad. Some dealers in Egypt acquired the antiquities outside of Egypt, and that might seem strange. But again, like Mustafa Akka, when you're a salesman, you need to generate an atmosphere. You smile to people, you shake their hands, you small talk, you do that sort of stuff to build a rapport, for instance, right? Another thing is creating a certain ambience. And so this is Ryholt, a visitor to Egypt 150 years ago. He says all antiquities are here at Thebes and in London. He came from London. And the demand is sometimes greater than the genuine supply. That is true. Often it was difficult to find objects. And then he says something that's interesting. Most people would buy thieves at large price, but they would not buy at a moderate price in Egypt, in London. If you're in Egypt and you see an antiquity, it looks very interesting, and you're there, and it's holidays, and blah, 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 and you want a souvenir. But if you're in London, you know, who cares for the shops here, right? I hope I don't offend anyone. And so sometimes the dealers knew that objects sold for less outside of Egypt. So when there were big auctions for some of the big dealers, they went abroad and they acquired antiquities. And then they brought them back to Egypt and they were sold once more. And this is an example of that. This is Breasted visiting Egypt in 1990 to collect antiquities. And he says that the dealers there had gone to London and purchased most of the Hilton Price collection that was auctioned off. And we have examples from other auctions too. So a lot of those objects went back to Egypt. And then there are collectors in Egypt selling their collections. I like this example. This is a British officer who acquired some collections of flints and scarabs and other objects. And Breasted made him an offer and offered him a good amount of money. But somehow Timmins, for some reason, sold his collection to a dealer. And then Breasted comments on it like this. He was furious he didn't get the collection. I've since learned that Timmins is an ass who doesn't know enough to keep his face straight. But as I thought I was dealing with a normal person, I lost 50 pounds. He still got the collection he wanted, but he had to buy it through a dealer. Yes. And then, of course, there's the production of fakes. And this is Lange talking, but this was a general saying at the time. Half of Luxor makes a living from manufacturing fake antiquities, and the other half from selling it. It's an exaggeration, but in the time between the sowing and harvest, a lot of people were engaged in it. There was an enormous production, especially in Luxor, not just in Luxor. And an example I found from the British Museum is this. Sorry, am I reading now? I know it's an anathema to put a scarab there. I found this hardstone scarab in the British Museum. I did not like the way it looked. Especially it has this little sign here that's incised, but it doesn't make sense in the description. You can read it, but the paleography is not good either. It's in the British Museum, came into the collection in '86, said to come from Gardner, Alan Gardner. It's not true, I think. And then a month later, going through the collection, I found this piece. It's the same one. It has an accidental scratch over here that's been reproduced. This one is genuine. So they have acquired both the genuine one and a forgery made on basis of that one, because usually they use genuine objects to mass produce fake objects. And it's just a funny coincidence that both came independently to the British Museum, and if I hadn't seen them within a few weeks of one another, I would not have recognized. So we're nearing the end now, sorry for going over time. So the end of the major trade in Egypt, well, the decline with the Second World War in '39, because Egypt becomes involved with the war, people don't travel because it's unsafe, and Egypt is part of the theater of war and so forth. After the war, there's a lot of resentment against the British. They have been there far too long, really overstayed their welcome, if there ever was a welcome. And on January 52, you have the beginning of the revolution. This is a picture of January 25th. This is Blanche's Antiquities shop. It was owned by a Frenchman at the time, Antiquities. Mansour's is over here. This is the Shepherd's Hotel. The Shepherd's Hotel had become a symbol of imperialism to the Egyptians because this is where the British officers were stationed during the war and also afterwards. So there were a lot of men in uniform there. And you can imagine the arrogance of some of these officers. I mean, they live up to those archetypes you see in movies. There's some truth to that. And so they were despised, and people despised the Shepherd's Hotel. And here's a picture taken 2 days later. This is what the hotel looked like. The antiquities shops are completely destroyed. They simply burned down this hotel and many other institutions that related to the Brits. They also killed a few Westerners then. And then in 1956, just a few years later, Israel and France and England, I think it was, invaded Egypt because of the Suez Canal. Which of course also upset the Brits. They saw the Egyptians, they saw the British returned just 4 years after they had kicked out with a new imperial nation force. And then of course Israel's a special problem for the Egyptians. The Americans saved the Egyptians. The Americans told the Britain, France, and Israel if they didn't leave Egypt, they would declare war on them. It's something people easily forget, and they were kicked out of Egypt for that reason. But of course, that just spurred even more resentment. And Egypt decided in '56 to expel almost all the foreigners there. And that's why there's so few Greeks and Italians and all these other people who used to live in Alexandria and elsewhere, that's the point where almost all of them lived. And then the really big problem for the Antiquities trade. This is Uncle Hassan, he called himself an interview. Chemicals have ruined the trade. So I'll buy a cup of coffee to whoever can guess what that means. Not Paula, I think, but everyone else. I don't know if anyone has a suggestion. There's just one slide left, I think. Go ahead.
Yes, because of the sabak.
Yes, they introduced chemical fertilizer. And so sabak dipping was not necessary and was abandoned. And of course, with the sabak digging, where they dug away entire ancient ruins, sometimes in a few weeks, and found thousands and thousands of objects, that stopped. And that's it. It's the stop of the sabak digging. So he was very sad. This modern invention of chemical fertilizer. Yeah. So there's a picture from the final years. This man, Alger, this is Rob de Marie as a young man visiting Cairo. His was one of the last jobs that survived. Unfortunately, his family didn't take the hint and they continued dealing antiquities. And about 10 years ago, his grandson and great-grandson was convicted of illegal antiquities trade. They had sent abroad, according to the court, I don't know where they got the number, more than 50,000 objects. I think that includes pearls and stuff. It's too large the number. I don't see where they would get it. But they were convicted to 55 and 60 years prison, and some of them were in their 60s already, so they must be dying. So nowadays, the punishments are quite hard. And so this is the situation now. There's no legal antiquities trade in Egypt, no private ownership of antiquities. And with that law in 83, those dealers that had a big stock was given 1 year to get rid of everything. So 83 was a good year to visit Egypt because all the dealers had to get rid of everything. Whatever they didn't sell would be taken back or given to the museum. So that finally concludes my lecture. Sorry for going over time, and thank you for your patience. I didn't see that I've gone 20 minutes over. I thought I was 5 minutes over. It's, yeah.
Many thanks for this interesting and amusing, but also